Hello, hello, everybody. Great to be with you again today. Folks have been asking me for more practical examples of what a personal anti burnout plan looks like, which makes sense, right? Because we've been talking about the general principles, what kind of questions do you need to ask, but it only really comes to life when you hear the story of how someone has applied it. And so today I'm going to share Kayla's story. And before I go any further, I just want to be really clear that Kayla is a composite character. And to tell the story, I have taken common threads from a number of people who have been in my courses or who I've worked with personally. And I've combined them as a way of bringing to life what a personal anti burnout plan looks like. Okay. So Kayla is a senior product manager in a tech company here in Seattle. And I met her when she took one of my courses, the Introduction to the Emotional Rescue Method course. And in that, we teach a science-backed method for regulating your emotions, for tapping into the energy of your emotions, building emotional resilience using mindfulness and somatic awareness. And so after that class, I went on to work one-on-one with Kaila in a coaching situation. And so just want to give you a little bit about where Kaila came from, a little bit about Kayla's background. So in her family, she held many firsts, right? She was the first to be born in the United States. She was first to go to college, and she was the first to go to graduate school, where she got a joint master's degree in computer science and business administration. So yes, Kaila is an achiever. Kaila is a striver. And so upon graduating with her master's degrees, Kaila landed a coveted job at a top company here in Seattle. And when she got there, she did what she knew best, what she's been doing all of her life, which is in spite of not looking like most of the people around her in the workplace, in spite of being the only one in the room, so to speak, she worked hard to figure out the game and she played it well. She kept climbing up to the next rung of the ladder, and then the next, and then the next. And it won't be any surprise to anyone that the pace in the tech industry was relentless. We're talking about long hours, sacrificing a ton of sleep, and not having much time for a personal life. So when Kaila was growing up, she was told that because she's a woman of color, she would have to work 3 times as hard to be considered equal. And she really internalized this lesson, and with good reason, right? She was in a male-dominated field where the attrition rates for BIPOC folks are quite high. And so there was some truth to what she heard growing up. So when I first met her, she was really burned out. She was physically exhausted, finding it hard to stay motivated and engaged at work. And she was feeling the word that what came up the most was empty. She wasn't really able to support those on her team who were looking to her for her leadership, and she was seriously considering leaving the industry altogether. So by this point, she was already feeling so overwhelmed, and we wanted to simplify things for her. So we identified 3 areas that she would need to build in order to transform her burnout, or 3 areas that she'd need to pay attention to. Those 3 were having the right tools, having a plan to actually apply those tools, and then building a community around her. So let's talk about some tools. I mentioned to you, right, Kaila was already overwhelmed, and there's a lot of tools out there. You know, do I take this course? Do I use this app? Do I read this book? It was a lot in a situation where her mind was already so full. And so last time I highlighted some key questions to help guide her choice of tools. And this is what we use to hone in on what would work best for her. So here are the questions. What tools would help her connect to, listen, and trust her own wisdom? What tools would help bring her back to her senses, bring her back to her body? By this point, Kaila was on serious autopilot and what I sometimes refer to as this burnout trance. And actually, she'd been on autopilot for so long, even longer than she'd been at this company, really throughout her whole education, as I mentioned earlier, head down, grinding it out, getting to the next level. And so there was so much deep conditioning in her family to define her success according to external standards, the American dream, et cetera, being the eldest daughter, the first. And so she was actually getting rewarded, right, for sticking to this program. Her intellect, her ambition had been affirmed time and time again, this so-called golden handcuffs, right? You've heard of that. And so given all this, tuning into her own internal compass and not the voice of her family, not the voice of societal expectations, was one of the biggest challenges. And this isn't something that only Kaila has to deal with, right? All of us, to some degree, internalize standards outside of ourselves, ignoring a deeper knowing of what brings us a sense of purpose and meaning, whether it's our family or the broader culture. So let me tell you, it was a really powerful moment when she began to realize how disconnected and distant she was from her own internal compass. It was a big moment to realize how little she actually trusted that when she was able to connect with it. So although it was this kind of powerful, a little bit of a painful moment, it was also a very healing moment, a breakthrough, to be honest, because within this awareness, she could begin to make a change. And so since I had met her in the Intro to Emotional Rescue Method course, she already was learning some tools of mindfulness, of somatic awareness to bring her back to her senses. And we talk a lot in that setting about how burnout is the suppression of emotions, the suppression of your authenticity. And so she had some science-backed methods for tapping into the energy of her emotions. And for her, and not for everybody necessarily, but for her, the ER method met that criteria of helping her to listen to, connect with, and trust her inner voice of wisdom. So it was a good choice of tool for her. I also asked her things like if she could remember the last time that she felt really creative, really open and connected, when she was doing something that had no other productive purpose than her own joy. Could she close her eyes for a moment and describe it for me using as many of her senses as possible? It was so interesting, right, to notice that she really had to dig way back for that memory. And there was grief that came along with that, because to realize, wow, how long has it been since she allowed herself that sort of experience? And so she named a couple of things, a pottery class she took in college, playing music with her friends. And what I loved about these was that these were really based in her senses. She talked about the smell of the clay, it's a particular smell, etc. The pottery wheel was very meditative. It brought her back to her senses, and it gave instant feedback. If her mind was wandering and she wasn't present, right, this clay would give her that feedback right away. It was using a different part of her brain. Is really joyful. So what does this have to do with emerging from burnout? Well, we're talking about tools. How do you know which tools to use? And so we're talking about tools that helped her return to her body, to her senses, help her tune into and give her a reliable way of tuning into her own compass and giving space to learn to trust it, to snap out of that burnout trance, or at least to start. So those kind of questions helped her hone in on tools. And the most important thing to remember here is that everyone is different. So you have to ask yourself these questions and see what tools work best for you. So the second thing we worked on with Kaila was to have a plan. So first, finding the right tools was absolutely the foundational step. But as we all know, the tools don't work unless you actually remember to use them. So you have to have a plan for how it's going to fit into your life, how you're going to apply it in your life. Otherwise, it's a waste of time, right? So in our courses and our coaching, we learn the science of habit change, and we use insights from psychology, from biology, and neuroscience. And those of you who know that it's one of my most favorite things to do, and it's hard not to geek out completely and get into all of that here. So I want to kind of translate that into maybe two important questions that you can ask yourself regarding a plan. First one is, how can I stack a new habit onto an old habit? And then the second is, how do I support myself to not, quote, break the chain? And I'll explain these for a little bit now, okay? So how can I stack a new habit onto an old habit? And this is something that's discussed a lot in the science of habit change, right? So the first thing you do is you identify something that you're already doing, and then you stack or link the new habit you want to build to the habit that's already established. So the key thing here is to make the new habit really small, really baby steps, really doable, because the principle that we'll get into with the not breaking the chain is about consistency, momentum, getting that muscle memory. So let's go back to Kaila. One of the tools that Kaila wanted to incorporate into her life was the ER method. And one of the things in the ER method that we talk a lot about is mindful gap. And so she wanted to figure out how to incorporate that into her life. So we figured out a habit that she was already doing. Well, she was already commuting to work. So we identified a habit stacking where she was going to use the act of unbuckling her seatbelt, right, as her reminder to practice that mindful gap that we learned in the ER method. So there was at least 2 times during the day when she'd unbuckle her seatbelt. Once when she got to the office, and once when she pulled up to her driveway when she got home, before she went in to dinner with her family. So she set an intention of using those 2 moments, and she'd set a timer on her phone for just 1 minute, literally 1 minute, and use the unbuckling sound of her seatbelt as the reminder for her to take that minute. So it was only 1 minute. It wasn't too long. You don't want it to be too overly ambitious to the point where you're just not going to do it. It's just going to be a non-starter, right? So the good news is that those little habit changes add up. And that time in the car was her chance to check in with her body and with her mind, to check in with her emotions, begin to listen to and trust her own voice, to ask herself, what am I actually feeling right now? Amazingly, and what's shocking to her, was that she hardly asked herself that when she was in autopilot, when she was in that trance. Right? And truth be told, she had an intention of doing it 2 times, one when she got to work and one when she got home from work. And it only ended up being workable doing it when she got home from work. So you can be flexible, do what works for you, right? But it did give her a valuable little respite, a time to listen to and connect to that own inner compass, a way of snapping out of the trance that she had been on. So I'd love to hear any other ideas you have about habit stacking. It's a pretty fun topic because then people get their creativity going and they share them. So please do share in the comments or write to me and let me know other ideas that you have about how to do that. So the second question was about, how do I support myself to not break the chain? And don't break the chain, I think actually came from, was it Jerry Seinfeld? I think it was him, and many other people besides him. But he talked about, getting a habit done every single day and making that chain as long as possible, right? So that refers to doing that habit with a sense of continuity so that you can get that muscle memory. You can lay down some new neural pathways in your brain that make it easier for that habit to stick. Some people say 21 days, 30 days. There's lots of different rules of thumb out there, but mainly it's about not breaking that chain to the extent that you can. So that means that the habit has to be small enough that you have a pretty good chance of not breaking that chain. Okay, so for Kaila, like I said, it seems small, but she began to remember to do it, and found that it really impacted the quality of her interactions with her family. And then eventually, when she was able to do it before she went into work, it also impacted the quality of her day at work. So lastly, community. There's so much research now that you're probably familiar with that shows that you can increase your chances of making changes in your life when you have a community of social support. And so the questions here go like this: how can I create accountability that's not about punishment or shaming? Right? That's not about calling out, but about calling in. Right? And what are we calling ourselves into? Here's another question: how can I redefine loyalty and safety in my community so that we are all making an alliance with our most noble aspirations? That's, we are making an alliance with our full potential of who we long to be. And in that case, what you're calling into, not calling out, but calling back into, is our noblest aspirations. Right? So that takes skill, that takes love, that takes some trust and safety. Right? So, but these are the kinds of things that you'd want to ask yourselves about your community. Another important question is, am I creating a dynamic of reciprocity where I'm seeing and loving and caring for others, but I'm also seeing and receive love and care from others? And so if you're a BIPOC person, if you're a queer person, we long to be in community with people who understand our lived experience. And there's so much power in that, but yet it can be so tricky. Why is it tricky? Is because if you have experienced racialized harm or homophobia, for example, it's impossible that would not have affected you or wounded you in a way that requires your love and healing. So when you get in a room with a bunch of people who have experienced that over their whole lifetimes, it shouldn't be a surprise, right, that our wounds end up bumping up against each other. That happens with all of us as humans, but in special case for BIPOC and queer folks. And so it requires careful tending, careful attention from people who understand this lived experience, and to the extent that we can include trauma-informed practices in our community building, that would really be a support. So for Kaila, asking these questions about community brought up a lot. First, she began to see how she was reproducing the same patterns in community that she had in her own family, right? Being the eldest daughter, taking care of everyone and everything. But there was this lack of reciprocity in her relationships. And this was another very powerful breakthrough moment for her, a very healing one. And so through putting her tools into practice with her plan, she was able to start recovering her energy, her joy, her creativity, and get to a more authentic sense of what gave her purpose and meaning. She began to realize that in community, it wasn't about fitting in and changing herself to fit in, but it was in order to really belong, it requires us to be exactly who we are, right? And that the work that she had been doing, applying the tools in her plan, over time began to help her be more authentic about who she was, and then she could be more discerning and draw more people around her who also wanted to be authentic, who could see her for who she actually was and for her authentic sense of purpose. And so this became the basis for a sense of safety and loyalty and accountability that wasn't based on fear, on shaming, but it was based on our noblest aspirations of who we want to be in the world, right? So to kind of close out for the moment, I want to remind us of a key point we've been talking about. So if burnout is the suppression of emotion, if burnout is the suppression of our authenticity, then having these three elements, the tools, the plan, the community, Kaila was able to rescue herself from burnout and reclaim the energy that she had lost, the joy that she had disconnected from. She was able to reclaim her creativity and a sense of meaning that was more in alignment with her inner compass and her inner sense of who she actually is and the process of evolving that she is in. So thank you all for asking for more concrete examples. I hope it was helpful. Be really curious to hear what you think, if you resonate or relate with anything that was shared in Kaila's story. And if you have any questions about any of what has been shared here, I look forward to hearing from you and wishing you all the best. Thanks.